born in 1946, right after World War II, and I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, because my dad was wounded in Europe, and he ended up in a hospital in Boston. And so my mother, they were married just before they left, just before he flew to Europe. He was a pilot. And so they came back to Boston, and I was born there. Then they're both from California, so then they moved out to California. Yeah, I got two brothers. I'm the only one that served in the military. My family's always been in business, sales, that sort of thing. You know, they always had their own businesses. The 60s were chaos. The 60s was chaos. That was the sexual revolution, that was the social revolution, the civil rights revolution. All that stuff took place in the 60s. And I ended up going to college. I graduated from high school in 64 and ended up at a school out here called Claremont Men's College, and spent 4 years there and graduated in 68. And 68 was the height of the Vietnam War. I basically was in ROTC. Anyway, ROTC is the Reserve Officer Training Program that you take during school. So you go to classes and you do drills and whatever during school. And then once you graduate, they commission you as an officer. An officer is a leader in the military, and I was a second lieutenant. So when I graduated from school, I had to go into the Army because I had an obligation for 2 years. That was during the draft period. When Johnson took over, Johnson decided to increase the troop strength in Vietnam. And so he went from 20,000 troops on the ground to 200,000 troops on the ground in 1965. So I was in college. I was a sophomore in college, and I thought, this does not look good. This looks like we're going to be in a war. And I would rather be an officer making decisions and doing things that might keep myself alive rather than have somebody else make decisions. And so I decided that I would join ROTC to be an officer. And the only ROTC program we had at Claremont was the Army program. So I didn't care. I didn't care what it was. I could have been in the Air Force. I could have been in the Navy. I didn't care. But I just wanted to make sure I was an officer so that I could control my own destiny. Because an officer makes decisions, but he's also responsible for the lives of the people under him. And so I joined ROTC, and then at the end of graduating, when I graduated, they guaranteed that they wouldn't draft me out of school. They guaranteed that I would be allowed to continue through the 4 years that it took to get a degree. And in those days, everybody got drafted if you weren't in school or if you didn't have good grades. And they threw you immediately into the Army, and you know, who knows what happens to you. So when I graduated, they gave me a chance to, I could either go to graduate school or I could go in the Army automatically and get my 2 years over. Now this is the height of Vietnam. This is when every time you turned the television on, you saw the caskets coming off the planes. They were losing men like mad. This was in the middle of a war, right in the middle of a war. 68 was the Tet Offensive. You never heard of the Tet Offensive, but the Tet Offensive was a major offensive battle in Vietnam that had a huge impact on the population, changed the attitude of many people towards the war in Vietnam. There was the anti-war movement that was going on during that period. And so when I graduated in 68, that was right in the middle of the Tet Offensive. That was also the Democratic Convention in Chicago that you'll read about in history that was a riot, and the anti-war movements rioted against the establishment, and they were fighting in the streets, and it was chaos. And so I decided, I went to graduate school for a couple of weeks. I said, I don't want to do this. And so I decided to go in the Army and take my chances. The Army is a culture. The Army is regimented. It's a heck of a lot easier for an officer than it is for an enlisted person. There aren't that many officers. So the food's better, the housing's better, they take better care of you. If you if you're going to be in the military, being an officer definitely has some advantages over being an enlisted person. You give orders rather than take orders, but I had more flexibility. Is it difficult? No, it's not difficult. Is it interesting and kind of a different culture than going to college? Yeah, you got to do stuff. You got to dress a certain way. You got to be up at a certain time. You have responsibilities. In my case, the first year I was in the military, they trained me in Nike missiles. In 1965, when I joined ROTC, these missiles were already 15 years old. In 1969 and 70, when I went on active duty, that was at the end of their useful life and they were beginning to obsolete them. These were missiles that were supposed to defend us from Russian bombers during the Cold War in 1950. And they had these sites all around America. And then decided that they needed infantry officers because they were dying off so fast. So they reassigned me as an infantry officer. You have no control over this at all. They sent me to another base. They gave me 2 weeks of training, which I never had any training in infantry before, and then they sent me to Vietnam. And the Central Highlands are the high plains in Vietnam where the rubber plantations are, and where there's an ethnic group up there called the Mountaineers that are Indians that have lived in that area of the world for decades and centuries and millennium. And the Vietnamese and the Chinese had settled into Vietnam. The northern part of Vietnam was where the Marines were. The central part of Vietnam was where the Army was. The southern part of Vietnam was where Saigon was and where Cam Ranh Bay was, and where the big metropolitan areas were. And then Vietnam was divided in the middle by a demarcation line during when the French were kicked out. They divided the country into two parts. North Vietnam became communist, and South Vietnam became an independent republic. When the communists started invading South Vietnam, President Kennedy and President Johnson said, we're going to defend them. So they sent troops in to fight the communists that were coming down from the north. Ho Chi Minh was the nationalist leader of North Vietnam under the French when they were fighting the French before they were an independent country. And this is a quad 50. It's 50 calibers that are used for convoy security and perimeter security. So in answer to your question, I had to learn very quickly what these things were, how they worked, and then I had 100 men that were assigned to the battery, and then I was a platoon leader. So in my platoon I had 2 squads of probably 25 or 30 men that I was responsible for. But on a fire base, which was a hilltop in the middle of nowhere, we'd have an artillery battery, and then we would be assigned to it, and we'd live in bunkers underground. When you're in combat 24 hours a day if you want to survive. My job was to keep everybody alive. So my job was to anticipate problems and keep people sharp, because the people under me were dependent on me for making decisions. And when you're an officer, you have to make decisions very quickly. You have to have a steep learning curve, because when I made mistakes in combat, people died. And so I had to make good decisions very quickly. When you're standing on the back of one of these tracks and you got people shooting at you, the emotion you have is pure fear. And you don't know pure fear until you've had somebody point a gun in your head. But this is all part of the military experience. This is all part of the combat experience. And combat is just something you don't wish to do. So combat is something you have to do periodically to defend yourself. So the emotions are, all the emotions you can imagine from one side to the other. I mean, it's everything. But your loyalties in combat are to the people around you. You'll do anything to keep everybody around you alive. And that's the way you survive. the only contact we had with home was a letter, and letters would arrive, once a couple of days or so, once a week or something, depending on where you were. And they'd have mail call, and they'd call out your name if you got a letter, and hand out the letter. And I got letters from my family and from friends, but most of my friends didn't serve in the military. During the 60s, a lot of people didn't serve in the military. A lot of people didn't want to be in the military. They were scared to death of Vietnam, and they didn't want to have anything to do with it. So a lot of them were kind of curious. How's it going over there? Because keep in mind, the only information people had about Vietnam was from the news at night. Vietnam was a difficult situation, and most people ask a question like that because they're looking for the anti-war type of response. Nobody likes to be in combat. Did my attitude change? No, my attitude didn't change, because you have to support the military, otherwise they won't support us. And that's the only reason we have the standard of living we have. That's the only reason this isn't Beirut, or this isn't pick a country, Syria. It's because we have a military to defend us. Somebody's got to do it. I don't know. I thought I did well. It's hard to adjust sometimes, because when you've been in that environment, and like I was in an environment where I had to anticipate problems. And I used to go around the house and lock the doors 2 or 3 times, because that's what I did in the military, is make sure the perimeter was okay. There is an adjustment. You have to get your head into the thing. You don't want to, you don't want to take somebody who's been in combat and surprise him unnecessarily. He might react a little differently, like take your head off or something. So there is an adjustment period, but I didn't have any problem adjusting. Most people don't. 99% don't. 1% have serious problems, and those are the ones we try to help. Yeah, I'm unique. When I sold my business a few years ago, I was asked to join a company called U.S. Vets, and I'd never joined a military organization or anything. After I got back, I just kind of put it aside. And there's a few friends of mine that knew I served in combat, but we never talked about it. Our generation never talked about it. So when they got me involved in this U.S. Vet program, which is a program that supports veterans, I was on the board, and then they asked me to take a full-time job, and so I found myself working with veterans. And now I'm still working with veterans. I'm doing it with Goodwill now in Orange County. So the answer to your question is yes, I hang around with veterans. I belong to the American Legion in Newport Beach. But I never did for the first 40 years. I only did it within the last 3 or 4 years.